The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds as Dr. Eleanor Hayes triple-checked her suitcase. Some people might call it being overly cautious, but Eleanor called it being thorough, the same quality that had carried her through 20 years as an aerospace engineer. Wallet, phone, ticket, presentation notes, she whispered to herself, patting each pocket in turn. The small leather notebook went into her carry-on last. That notebook contained 6 months of work, calculations that could change how military aircraft performed in extreme conditions. Not that anyone on the plane would know that. The ride to the airport was quiet, just how Eleanor liked it. The driver had tried making conversation at first, asking about her destination, but seemed to sense her preference for silence. She used the time to run through her presentation in her head again. 20 minutes to explain 2 decades of research to a room full of military officials who might or might not understand what she was talking about. Eleanor checked her watch as she walked through the terminal. 2 hours early, perfect. She hated rushing, hated the feeling of potentially missing a flight, of being at the mercy of long security lines or unexpected delays. Window seat 12F, the gate agent said, handing back her ID and boarding pass with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Eleanor understood. It was barely 6 a.m. and the woman had probably already dealt with dozens of grumpy travelers. "Thank you," Eleanor said, making sure to meet the woman's eyes. Small connections mattered, especially when you spent as much time alone with equations and computer models as Eleanor did. The boarding process was orderly, and Eleanor settled into her window seat with practiced efficiency. Bag under the seat in front of her, notebook in her lap, seatbelt fastened. She watched as the plane gradually filled, hoping against hope that the middle seat might remain empty. No such luck. "Looks like I'm your neighbor for the next few hours," said a man in his 40s, gesturing to the middle seat. He had kind eyes and a smile that seemed genuine. "I'm Tom." "Eleanor," she replied with a polite nod, not offering her hand. After years of being one of the few women in rooms full of male engineers, she'd learned to keep a certain professional distance. It wasn't personal, just habit. "Heading to D.C. for business or pleasure?" Tom asked as he stowed his bag in the overhead compartment. Eleanor hesitated. "Work meetings," she said finally, offering no further details. How could she explain that tomorrow she'd be standing in the Pentagon, trying to convince military brass that her innovations in thermal coating technology could extend fighter jet missions by nearly a quarter? Or that despite her credentials, despite the patents and the peer-reviewed articles, she still rehearsed her presentation like a nervous graduate student, because she knew that being a woman in her field meant she had to be twice as prepared as anyone else. Tom seemed to pick up on her reluctance and nodded. "Same here. Sales conference. Not exactly thrilling, but the company's paying, so..." He shrugged good-naturedly and pulled out a paperback. Eleanor felt a small twinge of guilt for her curtness. He seemed nice enough, but years of experience had taught her that politeness from women was often mistaken for invitation, and the last thing she needed was 4 hours of unwanted conversation when she could be reviewing her notes. As the plane taxied down the runway, Eleanor felt the familiar surge of both anxiety and fascination. The engineering part of her brain never failed to marvel at the miracle of flight, the precise calculations, the perfect balance of forces that allowed a metal tube weighing several tons to soar through the air with relative ease. The human part of her, however, still felt the primal unease of leaving solid ground. Once they reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Eleanor pulled out her notebook. Her fingers traced over the words she'd written at the top of the first page. "Invisible doesn't mean impossible." She'd first scribbled it down years ago, after a particularly difficult meeting where her ideas had been dismissed out of hand, only to be praised when presented by a male colleague weeks later. Since then, it had become something of a personal mantra: the things people couldn't see, the unseen currents of air around a jet wing, the invisible barriers facing women in science, the overlooked potential in seemingly ordinary materials. These weren't imaginary just because they weren't immediately visible. Eleanor flipped through her notes, making small annotations in the margins. The beauty of her work lay in its apparent simplicity. Her breakthrough hadn't come from inventing some flashy new material or revolutionary design. Instead, she'd looked at existing thermal coatings and found ways to reconfigure their molecular structure, creating microscopic channels that dispersed heat more efficiently. Is that a new language or really advanced math? Eleanor looked up, startled. Tom was glancing at her notebook, curiosity rather than intrusion in his expression. Sorry, he added quickly. Didn't mean to pry, just never seen notation like that before. Eleanor almost closed the notebook reflexively, then paused. It's a bit of both, I suppose. Engineering shorthand mixed with material science equations. You're an engineer? My daughter's looking at engineering programs for college. She's great at math, always has been, but says she's not sure if engineering is her thing, whatever that means. He laughed softly. Something in Eleanor softened slightly. What kind of engineering is she considering? Mechanical, I think. Though honestly, the differences between all the types go over my head. For the next few minutes, Eleanor found herself explaining the various branches of engineering, watching as Tom nodded and occasionally jotted something in his phone, presumably notes to share with his daughter. It felt good, she realized, to talk about her field without the pressure of proving herself. So what kind of engineer are you? Tom asked eventually. Aerospace, Eleanor replied, and was surprised to hear the pride in her voice. Usually she downplayed it, knowing the questions that often followed, questions that somehow implied she must be exaggerating her role or expertise. That's amazing, Tom said simply. Must be incredible to work on things that fly. Eleanor was saved from responding by the arrival of the beverage cart. After ordering a ginger ale, she turned back to her notebook, but found her focus had shifted. The conversation had reminded her why she loved her work in the first place, not for the recognition or the battle to be taken seriously, but for the pure beauty of solving problems that helped machines soar higher, faster, and safer. Outside the window, clouds drifted past like islands in a vast blue sea. Eleanor thought about the F-22 Raptors her work had helped improve, streaking through skies much higher than this commercial flight. The pilots would never know her name, would never realize that the reason they could fly certain missions was because of calculations done by a woman who sometimes still didn't feel like she belonged. In the rooms where decisions were made, invisible doesn't mean impossible, she murmured to herself, and returned to her notes with renewed purpose. The gentle hum of the engines provided a comforting background as Eleanor worked, occasionally sipping her ginger ale, unaware that in a few hours, a weather system building hundreds of miles away would change the course of her carefully planned trip, and much more besides. 3 hours into the flight, Eleanor was deep in concentration, mentally rehearsing how she would explain her thermal coating innovations to the Pentagon officials. The slight shake of the plane barely registered at first, just another patch of turbulence in an otherwise smooth journey. Then came another shake, stronger this time. Eleanor glanced up from her notebook, noticing the flight attendants exchanging looks as they quickly secured the beverage cart. Outside her window, the clear blue sky had given way to thick, dark clouds. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. The voice over the intercom was calm but firm. We've encountered an unexpected weather system ahead. For your safety, we'll be changing our route and making an unscheduled landing to wait out the storm. A collective groan rose from the passengers. Eleanor felt her carefully planned schedule crumbling. Her presentation was early tomorrow morning. She'd allowed extra time for preparation in her hotel room, for a good night's sleep, for all the small rituals that helped calm her pre-presentation nerves. Any idea where we're landing? Tom asked, leaning slightly toward her. Eleanor shook her head, trying to mask her rising anxiety. She pulled out her phone, checking the weather map. A massive system had developed, seemingly out of nowhere, covering much of their planned route to D.C. 20 minutes later, the captain's voice returned. We've been cleared for landing at Andrews Air Force Base. We apologize for the inconvenience, but this is the nearest suitable airfield that can accommodate us until the weather clears. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Andrews Air Force Base, home to Air Force One and a major military aviation hub. Under normal circumstances, commercial flights didn't land there. It wasn't exactly a comforting thought that the weather was bad enough to warrant this kind of exception, but beneath her anxiety, a small spark of professional curiosity ignited. How many civilian aerospace engineers got to see Andrews up close? The descent was bumpier than usual, with the plane occasionally dropping in a way that made Eleanor's stomach lurch. She gripped her armrests, knuckles white, and found herself mentally reviewing the engineering behind aircraft stabilization systems to calm her nerves. Not a fan of turbulence? Tom asked, noticing her tension. Knowing exactly how the plane works doesn't always make it easier, Eleanor admitted with a tight smile. Sometimes it means you can imagine all the things that could go wrong in vivid detail. The landing, when it finally came, was remarkably smooth given the conditions. As the plane taxied to a stop, Eleanor could see military personnel approaching on the tarmac. Through the rain-streaked window, she glimpsed rows of hangars in the distance and what looked like fighter jets under protective covering. "Folks, we've been advised that you'll be escorted to a waiting area while arrangements are made," the captain announced. "Please bring all your personal belongings with you. Air Force personnel will provide further instructions." The deplaning process was orderly but tinged with nervous energy. Passengers whispered to each other, some excited about the unexpected adventure of landing on a military base, others openly annoyed at the delay. Eleanor clutched her carry-on bag close, acutely aware of the sensitive nature of her presentation materials. The notebook contained nothing classified. She'd been careful about that. But it did hold proprietary information her company wouldn't want floating around, especially not on a military installation where competitors might have connections. As they were led across the tarmac to a nearby building, the rain fell in sheets. Despite the military personnel's attempts to shield them with large umbrellas, Eleanor was damp by the time they reached the door. Inside was a large room that looked like it had been hastily converted from some kind of briefing area into a passenger waiting room. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Andrews Air Force Base." A young airman stood at the front of the room, his posture perfect. "We understand this isn't your planned destination, and we're working to make your wait as comfortable as possible. Current forecasts indicate the weather system should pass within 4 to 6 hours. A collective sigh swept through the group. 6 hours. Eleanor did the math quickly. Even if they took off in exactly 4 hours, she'd still arrive in D.C. well after midnight, with barely time to check into her hotel before heading to the Pentagon for her 7:30 a.m. meeting. She found a seat near the wall and pulled out her phone to email her contact at the Pentagon, explaining the situation. As she typed, she overheard 2 young airmen talking nearby, their voices low but not quite low enough. "Did you see them land?" "The pair of Raptors?" one asked, excitement barely contained. "Yeah, just made it in before the storm front. Lieutenant Kelly said they're here for tomorrow's demonstration. Can't believe we get to see them up close." Eleanor's fingers paused over her phone. F-22 Raptors, the very aircraft her thermal coating innovations had been designed for. What were the odds? She glanced up, studying the young airmen more carefully. They couldn't be more than 25, with the eager look of those still new enough to the Air Force to be openly excited about the aircraft they supported. After sending her email, Eleanor stood and stretched, casually moving closer to where the airmen were now helping an elderly passenger find the restroom. When one returned, she approached him with a polite smile. "Excuse me," she said. "I couldn't help overhearing about the weather delay. Is there any chance there's somewhere I might be able to continue working while we wait? I have an important presentation tomorrow morning." The young man, Airman Chen according to his name badge, looked her over, perhaps assessing whether she was just trying to get special treatment. "What kind of work, ma'am?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated. "Engineering calculations," she said finally, holding up her notebook just enough for him to see the complex notations without reading any details. "I'm presenting at the Pentagon tomorrow morning." Something in her demeanor, the quiet confidence, the precision of her words, made Airman Chen look at her more carefully. "Let me check with my supervisor," he said after a moment. "Most of our conference rooms are in use today, but there might be a space you could use." As he walked away, Eleanor noticed the second airman returning, his posture becoming more formal as an older woman in uniform approached. Eleanor recognized the eagles on her shoulders. A full colonel. "Ma'am," the airman said, "the passengers from Flight 2743 are all accounted for. We're arranging for refreshments now." "Good work, Airman Rodriguez," the colonel replied, her eyes scanning the room. For a brief moment her gaze met Eleanor's, and Eleanor had the strange sensation of being assessed. Not as a stranded passenger, but as something else entirely. Airman Chen returned, breaking the moment. "Ma'am, if you'll follow me, we found a small office you can use. It's not much, but it has a desk and it's quiet." "Thank you," Eleanor said, gathering her belongings. "I really appreciate it." As Chen led her through a series of hallways, Eleanor caught glimpses of the base's operations, briefing rooms with maps on the walls, offices filled with uniformed personnel, and through one large window, a view of a hangar where technicians worked on what must be one of the newly arrived F-22s. Eleanor slowed her pace, unable to resist looking. The aircraft was partially visible, its distinctive profile unmistakable even to civilian eyes. But to Eleanor, it was more than just an impressive fighter jet. It was the culmination of thousands of engineering hours, countless innovations, and yes, her own contributions to its thermal management systems. Beautiful, aren't they? Airman Chen said, following her gaze. The F-22s, I mean. We don't get to see them here as often as we'd like. Yes, Eleanor agreed softly. They certainly are. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say without revealing too much, was that she knew exactly how beautiful they were, inside and out. That the elegant solution hidden beneath the aircraft's skin, the thermal coating that allowed it to maintain optimal performance even under extreme conditions, had begun as equations in the very notebook she now carried. As Airman Chen opened the door to a small, plain office, Eleanor thanked him again. What had started as a frustrating delay was quickly becoming something else entirely, a rare opportunity to see her work in its true environment, not just as theoretical models on a computer screen or data points in a test facility. She settled at the desk, opening her notebook to continue her preparation. But her mind kept drifting to the hangar, to the aircraft, to the pilots who would soon fly machines protected by her. Innovations, pilots who had no idea that the woman from seat 12F had anything to do with their mission, capabilities. Eleanor had been working for about 30 minutes, when a knock interrupted her concentration. She looked up to see Airman Chen standing in the doorway with a paper cup of coffee and a wrapped sandwich. "Thought you might be hungry, ma'am," he said, placing both on the desk. "The colonel asked me to check on you." "The colonel?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Why would a high-ranking officer concern herself with one stranded passenger? "Yes, ma'am." "Colonel Rivera. She's overseeing the F-22 demonstration preparations." He hesitated, then added, "She noticed you looking at the aircraft earlier." Eleanor thanked him for the food, wondering if she'd somehow drawn unwanted attention. She'd been careful not to take photos or even stare too long at the planes, knowing the sensitivity around military aircraft. After Airman Chen left, Eleanor sipped the coffee, surprisingly good for military-based coffee, and tried to refocus on her presentation. But curiosity kept pulling her thoughts back to the F-22s. What version of her thermal coating were they using? Had her latest modifications been implemented yet? She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the new figure in the doorway until a voice spoke. "Dr. Eleanor Hayes?" Eleanor's head snapped up. The colonel from earlier stood there, her expression a mix of curiosity and something else Eleanor couldn't quite read. "Recognition, perhaps, yes?" Eleanor replied cautiously, closing her notebook. "Colonel Diana Rivera," the woman said, stepping inside and extending her hand. "Engineering Corps." "I apologize for the interruption, but when Airman Chen mentioned we had an engineer from Seat 12F who seemed particularly interested in our F-22s, I had a hunch. I checked the passenger list and, well, I couldn't believe my luck." Eleanor shook the colonel's hand, still confused. "I'm afraid I don't understand," Colonel Rivera smiled. "Your work on thermal barrier coatings is implemented in those very engines outside. I've read all your papers on microscale heat dispersion channels. Brilliant stuff." A warm flush spread across Eleanor's cheeks. After years of fighting for recognition, having someone immediately know her work felt almost surreal. "You've read my papers?" Eleanor asked, unable to hide her surprise. "Required reading in advanced propulsion systems these days," Colonel Rivera said with a nod. "Your 2022 breakthrough on ceramic matrix composites changed our approach to heat management in military aircraft. I've been following your publications since graduate school." Eleanor hadn't expected this, to be recognized not just as any engineer, but specifically for her innovations, and by someone who truly understood their significance. In her experience, even when her work was implemented, the credit often went to the broader team or the company, rather than to her specifically. "I'm heading to the Pentagon tomorrow to present some new refinements to that technology," Eleanor admitted, gesturing to her notebook. "What a coincidence." Colonel Rivera leaned against the doorframe, Our F-22 pilots are here specifically to demonstrate the performance enhancements from your previous generation of coatings. A thought occurred to Eleanor. Would it be possible to see them? The engines, I mean. Up close. She rarely got to see her work in its final application, especially not in military aircraft. Colonel Rivera considered for a moment. Normally I'd say no. Security protocols and all that. But considering you literally designed components of what's in those engines, she checked her watch. I can give you 15 minutes before my next briefing. Bring your ID. 5 minutes later, Eleanor found herself walking alongside Colonel Rivera toward the hangar she'd glimpsed earlier. The rain had eased to a light drizzle, and the smell of jet fuel hung in the air, a scent that had always oddly comforted Eleanor. The smell of possibilities, of human ingenuity taking flight. We'll need to be quick, Colonel Rivera said as they approached the security checkpoint. The maintenance crew is prepping for tomorrow's demonstration, and they get twitchy when brass brings visitors. After checking Eleanor's ID and making a quick call, the security officer waved them through. Inside the hangar, the noise level jumped. The clang of tools, voices calling instructions, the occasional whine of testing equipment. And there they were, 2 F-22 Raptors, their sleek forms making Eleanor's heart beat faster with professional pride. Captain Lee, Colonel Rivera called to a man in a flight suit checking something on a tablet. Got someone here you might want to meet. The pilot looked up, his expression neutral but curious. He was younger than Eleanor had expected, maybe mid-30s, with the focused intensity she'd come to associate with test pilots. Captain, this is Dr. Eleanor Hayes. The captain's polite smile didn't change, clearly not recognizing the name. The thermal coating specialist, Colonel Rivera added. The change was immediate. Captain Lee's eyes widened slightly and he straightened, almost coming to attention. Dr. Hayes, your heat dispersion channels are the reason I can push these birds 23% harder without cooking the engines. It's an honor. Eleanor felt a strange disconnection. Here was someone who interacted directly with her work, whose life might literally depend on her calculations being correct. And yet until today, they'd occupied completely separate worlds. The honor's mine, she replied, finding her voice. I rarely get to see the practical application of my research. Practical application? Captain Lee laughed. Ma'am, your practical application let me outmaneuver 2 older jets in a training exercise last month. They couldn't match our sustained thrust because their engines would have overheated. A second pilot joined them, introduced as Captain Reyes, and soon Eleanor found herself surrounded by not just the pilots but several maintenance technicians, all eager to share stories about how her innovations had improved their work and missions. We've got the panels off the port engine for routine checks, Captain Reyes said. Would you like to see your coating in action, Doctor? Eleanor nodded, unable to find words. She'd spent countless hours in labs and at computers developing these materials, but always at a distance from their final use. Now she was being invited to literally touch the technology that had gone from equations in her notebook to a critical component of one of the world's most advanced fighter jets. As they moved toward the aircraft, Eleanor noticed other personnel in the hangar watching with growing interest. Word was spreading. The woman from the diverted commercial flight wasn't just any passenger. She was the mind behind technology they worked with every day. One of the maintenance chiefs, a weathered man with sergeant stripes who introduced himself as Ortiz, showed her where her coating had been applied, explaining how they monitored its condition between flights. This section here, he said, pointing to an area near the engine exhaust, used to be our biggest headache. We'd have to replace components after every 3rd or 4th high-stress mission. Now, we're seeing 5 times the durability. Eleanor crouched to get a better look, carefully touching the surface that had begun as molecular models on her computer screen years ago. See that pattern? She asked, pointing to a barely visible texture on the coating. Those are the microchannels I designed to draw heat away from critical components. They're smaller than a human hair, but they increase heat dispersion by nearly 200% compared to traditional coatings. The technical staff gathered closer, and Eleanor found herself giving an impromptu lesson on thermal dynamics, watching as understanding dawned on their faces. These weren't just theoretical concepts to them. This was knowledge that directly affected their daily work. Dr. Hayes, Colonel Rivera said finally, checking her watch. I hate to cut this short, but we both have other obligations. As they walked back toward the building housing the stranded passengers, Eleanor felt a shift in how people looked at her. Word had traveled fast. Airmen nodded respectfully as she passed. A group of technicians stopped their conversation to watch her walk by. Your diversion might have been fortunate timing, Colonel Rivera said. We're having a briefing with the demonstration team this evening. Would you consider joining us? Your insights would be invaluable, especially since you're already here. Eleanor hesitated, thinking of her Pentagon presentation tomorrow. She should be preparing, reviewing her notes one more time. But the opportunity to directly connect with the people who used her technology, to see firsthand how her work translated from theory to reality, it was too compelling to refuse. I'd be honored, she said, and meant it. As they reached the door, Colonel Rivera paused. You know, Dr. Hayes, most of us go our entire careers never meeting the minds behind the technologies we depend on. Today, you're not just the woman from seat 12F anymore. You're a reminder that behind every advancement, every capability we have, there's a person who dared to see possibilities others missed. Eleanor smiled, thinking of her tagline, "Invisible doesn't mean impossible." Perhaps today was proof of exactly that. Colonel Rivera led Eleanor to a conference room where the briefing would be held. Before entering, Eleanor quickly stopped by the passenger waiting area to check on her flight status and grab her carry-on. She spotted Tom reading his book in the corner. Everything okay? He asked, looking up. You disappeared for a while. Eleanor hesitated, unsure how to explain what had happened. I got a bit of a tour, she said finally. And now I've been asked to join a meeting. Tom raised his eyebrows but didn't press for details. They're saying another 2 hours before we can leave. Good luck with your meeting. When Eleanor entered the briefing room with Colonel Rivera, conversation gradually quieted as heads turned toward them. The room contained about 20 people, the 2 F-22 pilots she'd met earlier, several other officers in flight suits, technical staff, and a few civilians who Eleanor guessed were contractors or specialists like herself. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Rivera announced, we have an unexpected guest joining us today, Dr. Eleanor Hayes, whose thermal coating technology you've all been working with, happened to be on one of the diverted commercial flights. Eleanor felt a flush creep up her neck as all eyes turned to her. In her 20 years as an engineer, she'd never experienced this kind of recognition. Usually she was the one fighting to be heard in rooms full of men who talked over her or claimed her ideas as their own. Colonel Rivera gestured to an empty chair. Dr. Hayes, please join us. We were just discussing the parameters for tomorrow's demonstration flights. As Eleanor took her seat, a man across the table, introduced as Dr. Wilson from the Air Force Research Laboratory, leaned forward. Dr. Hayes, your timing is remarkable. We were just debating how much we can safely push the engines with the current generation of your coating. Eleanor opened her notebook, her initial nervousness giving way to the comfort of technical discussion, the arena where she'd always felt most confident. What specific concerns do you have? She asked, and just like that, she was no longer an outsider or a diverted passenger, but a key contributor to the conversation. For the next half hour, Eleanor listened as the team outlined their plan for tomorrow's demonstration. The F-22s would showcase extreme maneuverability at supersonic speeds, pushing right to the edges of their performance envelope to impress a visiting congressional delegation that controlled military funding. When Captain Lee mentioned his concern about heat buildup during a particular high-G maneuver, Eleanor cleared her throat. May I? She asked, gesturing to the digital display showing engine performance metrics. Colonel Rivera nodded, and Eleanor stood, moving to the front of the room. The confidence that had always existed in her mind when working with her designs now spread through her entire body. This was her territory. Your concern is valid, she began, pointing to the heat distribution diagram. But you're basing it on data from the original coating implementation. The current version installed 3 months ago has an additional microchannel pattern here and here. She pointed to 2 areas near the thrust vectoring components. She took a breath, then decided to share what she'd planned to reveal at the Pentagon tomorrow. And the version I'm presenting to the Department of Defense tomorrow adds a third pattern that increases heat dispersion by another 17%. The room fell silent for a moment before erupting in technical questions. Eleanor answered each one, her hands sketching diagrams in the air, occasionally jotting equations in her notebook to illustrate a point. She noticed Captain Reyes watching her with particular intensity. When there was a brief pause in the questions, he spoke up. "Dr. Hayes, forgive me for asking, but why haven't we met before? Something this critical to our aircraft. You'd think they'd have brought you to speak with the actual pilots." Eleanor hesitated, unsure how to answer without sounding bitter. "My work is usually presented by the company's senior executives or military liaisons," she said finally. "I develop the technology. Others handle the presentations." She didn't add that those others were typically men who understood the Pentagon's traditional culture and connections, men who sometimes stumbled when asked technical questions but were never questioned about their expertise the way she was. Captain Lee frowned. "That's a mistake. No offense to the suits, but having the actual mind behind the technology here has been more valuable than a dozen standard briefings." Colonel Rivera, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Dr. Hayes, would you consider giving us a preview of tomorrow's presentation, particularly the parts relevant to flight operations?" Eleanor glanced at her watch. The flight delay would still leave her time to reach D.C. tonight, and presenting here to this group who actually understood and used her work suddenly felt more important than the formal Pentagon briefing. "I'd, be happy to," she said, and noticed Colonel Rivera typing something into her tablet with a slight smile. Eleanor opened her notebook to her presentation notes and took a deep breath. She'd spent weeks preparing for tomorrow, crafting careful explanations, anticipating political questions, worrying about how to make military officials understand the value of her work. But here now, none of that seemed necessary. These people already valued her contribution. They didn't need to be convinced. They needed to be equipped with knowledge. "Invisible doesn't mean impossible," she began, and saw a few confused looks. "That's been my guiding principle throughout this research. Just because we can't see heat doesn't mean we can't control how it moves." For the next 40 minutes, Eleanor walked them through her innovations in a way she never could have at the Pentagon. She didn't simplify or gloss over technical details. She didn't have to justify the science. These people lived with its results every day. The pilots asked practical questions about how her technology would affect their flight capabilities. The maintenance crew wanted to know about durability and inspection procedures. The engineers questioned her about materials and manufacturing processes, and Eleanor answered them all, drawing on 20 years of expertise that had too often been hidden behind corporate presentations and simplified briefings. For once, she wasn't fighting to be heard or taken seriously. She was simply sharing knowledge with people who valued it. As she concluded, explaining how her newest innovation could extend mission durations by an additional 23%, she noticed that everyone in the room was sitting straighter, their attention absolute. The pilots in particular seemed to be mentally calculating what this meant for their capabilities and safety margins. "Any questions?" she asked, suddenly aware of how comfortable she felt standing before this group. Captain Lee raised his hand. "Just one. Can we keep you?" The room filled with laughter, but Eleanor could tell the question wasn't entirely a joke. These people, the ones who flew the planes, maintained the engines, pushed the limits of the technology, understood the value of having direct access to the minds that created their tools. As the briefing wound down, Colonel Rivera approached Eleanor with an unexpected question. "Dr. Hayes, how would you feel about joining us on the observation platform for tomorrow's demonstration? The congressional delegates will be there, along with several high-ranking Pentagon officials." She paused. "Including, I believe, the people you're scheduled to meet." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "You mean instead of my Pentagon meeting?" Colonel Rivera smiled. "Not instead of. As part of it. I've made a few calls. Your meeting has been relocated here, where they can see your technology in action rather than just hearing about it in a conference room." For a moment, Eleanor couldn't find words. After years of fighting to be taken seriously, of carefully packaging her ideas for military and corporate consumption, someone had finally recognized that her work spoke most eloquently when seen in action. "I'd be honored," she said finally, and meant it from the bottom of her heart. As the room cleared, Eleanor gathered her notes, her mind already racing with how to adapt her presentation for this new, unexpected opportunity. Captain Lee stopped by her chair on his way out. "Dr. Hayes," he said quietly, "just so you know, what you've created doesn't just improve performance, it saves lives. Heat failure has taken down more than one good pilot. When we push these birds to their limits tomorrow, we'll be doing it with confidence because of you." He nodded respectfully and left, leaving Eleanor to absorb the weight of his words. Her work, her formulas and materials science, translated directly into human lives protected. All those nights working late in the lab, all those battles in boardrooms and technical reviews, this was what they had been for.